Hey students, my name is Erica and I'm from the Findlay campus. If you are anything like me, you probably had at some point in your life asked the question, who am I? Maybe you haven't used the actual words, who am I, but you may have thought or wondered some version of that question. What we're really asking is about our identity. Identity is what makes us us. It's what makes us unique and causes us to be different from everyone else. And if you're like me, you can sometimes struggle to even begin to understand how to answer this question. The tricky thing about identity is that most of the time we're not asking the question with just ourselves in mind. We're deciding who we are based on what people around us think or based on who they are. We tend to base our identity on what others expect of us. We think about what other people want to be or need us to be. We constantly feel the pressure to live up to the expectations of family, friends, teachers, coaches. Our parents want us to be responsible, so we see responsible as being part of our identity. Or a coach wants us to be a leader, so we make that a part of our identity. It's not who we actually are as much as it is who people think we should be. At the same time, we tend to base our identity on areas where we feel judged by others. We see ourselves through the lens of not being enough of whatever they expect us to be. We're not beautiful enough. We're not funny enough. We're not tall enough, not confident enough, not smart enough. And the list goes on and on. We define who we are based on the areas where we feel like we don't measure up. Maybe you feel like you have to act or be a certain way because of your race or cultural background. And for you, maybe you realize that you're more than the label or judgment others place on you, but you're not sure what that means or what that looks like. You just know that what others have given you is an incomplete picture, and there's more to you than that. Also, we tend to base our identity on our image, how we appear to others. Others see us as a star athlete, so that's how we see ourselves. Our teachers see us as a below average student, so that's how we see ourselves. But no matter how we would explain our identity, the question for all of us is the same. It's really the question underneath, who am I? This one big question feeds our identity, drives the decision we make, and determines the friends we have. The question is, am I enough? Some of you may answer this question with yes. You'd probably say, yes, I'm enough, but, and you may be quick to point out the areas where you're not measuring up. Because let's be honest, the areas where we don't measure up seem to take up a lot more of our thinking than the areas where we do, right? Others of you may answer the question by saying, no, I'm not enough because of whatever. No matter what anyone tells us, we just have a hard time believing that we could ever be enough. However you answer that question, there's good news. What we talk about today has the potential to be a game changer for you in the way you answer it moving forward. I probably don't have to tell you this, but people have been wondering, am I enough, since the beginning of time. Today, we're going to look back at an interaction between Jesus and a group of people in the book of John, which is one of the 4 books of the Bible that talk about Jesus' life on earth. In John's book, he records a miracle that Jesus performed. Check it out. After this, Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Tiberias Sea. A large crowd followed him because they had seen the miraculous signs he had done among the sick. Jesus went up a mountain and sat there with his disciples. It was nearly time for Passover, the Jewish festival. Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him. He asked Philip, "Where will we buy food to feed these people?" Jesus said this to test him, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "More than half a year's salary worth of food wouldn't be enough for each person to have even a little bit." And that comes from John 6, verses 1 through 7. So right away, there's a problem. Jesus could tell the people are hungry. The disciples are freaking out. I would be too. Hungry people become hangry people really fast. I lose my mind when I skip a meal. So the disciples were wondering what to do. None of the disciples make enough money to buy enough food to feed all these people. But Jesus didn't seem worried. Check out what happens next. One of his disciples Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, "A youth here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that for a crowd like this?" And that's John 6, verses 8 and 9. Andrew mentions that there's a youth who has some food. We aren't even told if this youth is a boy or a girl. It's just a young person, maybe even a child. And in the first century culture, that would have made this kid not so valuable in the eyes of society. In fact, children tended to be viewed only as property. The only value children had is what they could do for their family. But there's something else to notice. The young person didn't have regular bread. He or she had barley bread. And it's interesting that John decided to include that detail because back then, this was the kind of bread that people who were poor ate. It was this kind of bread that you ate when you didn't have a lot of money or status. The child obviously didn't come from a family with a lot, but he or she was willing to share what they had anyway. John continues. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass there. They sat down, about 5,000 of them. Then Jesus took the bread. When he had given thanks, he distributed it to those who were sitting there. He did the same thing with the fish, each getting as much as they wanted. When they had plenty to eat, Jesus said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing will be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of barley loaves that had been left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw that he had done a miraculous sign, they said, "This is truly the prophet who is coming into the world." Jesus understood that they were about to come and force him to be their king. So he took refuge again, alone in the mountain. And that was John 6, verses 10 through 15. Jesus did something miraculous, extraordinary, something someone with superpower could do. He took a little bit of barley bread and fish, and he fed the crowd. There ended up being so much food that there were even leftovers. That's a crazy miracle. Jesus is the obvious hero of the story, but John makes a point to draw attention to a different hero, the youth in the story. Not given a name, not coming from wealth or privilege, not having much to offer. He was still featured front and center. I wonder if John doesn't want us to forget the role Jesus allowed that kid to have in the story. Jesus could have provided the food with no help at all. I mean, he made blind people see, brought the dead back to life. It wouldn't have taken much to bring food out of nowhere. But that's not what happened. Jesus takes the food from a barely noticed child and makes the child a part of the story taking place. Why? Jesus knew who this kid was. This kid was made in the image of God, and he might have been young, but he had a story worth celebrating. Jesus wasn't limited by what this kid had or didn't have. And the same is true for us. Jesus said that what we have and who we are is enough. Think of it this way. You don't have to prove you're enough. Jesus takes our feelings of not enough and tells us we are enough. See, it's exhausting to have so much of our identity tied up in what other people think, expect, or want from us. It makes us feel like the bar is always moving and the standard is always changing for who we should be. We may be enough in this situation with this person today, but what about tomorrow? Who knows? Which is why what Jesus said is so important. There's such good news for us. He loves us, and that doesn't change. He's not temperamental with his feelings. He isn't wondering what we can offer. You are enough because Jesus says you're enough. The feeling of not being enough is a normal part of being human. At some point or another, we all deal with it. In response, we may try to prove we have what it takes. We practice harder, study harder, work harder, and put in more energy. We try to prove to people that we're the best athlete, the most accomplished student, or the employee of the month. Or we try to hide so that no one notices. Feeling like we're not enough feeds into our insecurities, so we do everything we can to keep people from seeing it. So what can we do when those feelings come up? Start by asking these questions. Where in my life do I feel like I'm not enough? Around friends, at home, when it comes to grades, sports, at church? When I don't feel like I'm enough, do I tend to respond by hiding or proving myself or something else? How different would my life look if I stopped trying to prove myself or hide in this area? Or put it another way, what would it look like to believe Jesus when he said, I'm enough? When I feel this way, how am I going to remember that I'm enough? A tip from my own experience, memorize what God said is true about me. Helps when I start to believe differently. Ephesians 2:10 may be a good place to start. Here, the Apostle Paul writes, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." That first phrase is a good place to start. We are God's handiwork, a piece of art. When we battle the feeling of not being enough, one of the worst things we could do is believe that we have to deal with it alone. That's why we care so much about small groups and small group leaders, because everybody needs someone to remind them what is true when it feels like truth is not in them. I imagine that even the youth in the story we just read wanted to provide for more than just himself or herself. I imagine that this youth wanted to do something to help. That's why they offered their food to Jesus. But it's also important to note that Jesus was able to create a miracle, to create enough when there wasn't enough. Being enough is more about what feels good about yourself. That's important. It's also about knowing you have everything you need to be a major force of good in the lives of others. Imagine what might be possible if you started to believe that you are enough and that God could use you as a force for good in the lives of others. And what if the people in your small group started to believe that they were enough? What if you walked into school believing that about yourself so that you could take a break from trying to prove or hide? Imagine what you may feel instead. I really believe it could change you and the people around you. Remember, you don't have to prove you are enough because Jesus says you are enough.